In the earliest days of the pandemic, when the world was locked down and everyone went into isolation, video games played a vital role in keeping people connected. Wedding parties in Animal Crossing, concerts in Fortnite, classrooms in Minecraft. In a time when everyone was figuring out how to move their lives to the virtual world, video games were there to fill in the gaps. Games aren't just a niche hobby or a childish amusement anymore. According to a 2021 survey, about 2/3 of US adults play video games, and the median age of US video game players is 31. Video games are made for and played by everyone, and the industry is beginning to change to reflect that. At their best, video games are an incredibly unifying force, breaking down barriers across cultural and demographic lines. But the sad truth is, video games, and gaming generally, haven't always lived up to that promise. Many games, despite their mass appeal, can still feel exclusionary to a wide swath of players who may not have been top of mind for the developers when they originally made the game. This is Next Level, a show about how video games shape the real world. In this episode, we're looking at those cultural barriers that still exist for even some iconic games.
Step back! We'll not tolerate drow in here.
And how people who love games, both inside and outside the industry, are using games to educate existing audiences and to embrace new ones. One genre where this shift is playing out is historical strategy games. This niche genre gives its players the ultimate freedom to get creative and mess around with the familiar elements of history. Titles like Civilization and Crusader Kings allow people to realize their empire-building dreams. These games have influenced how players have understood history for years, but they've also been adapting with our changing understanding of how history is really made. The American Civil War was a time of great strife for our country, but a time of great opportunity for the independent state of Texas. Having already claimed New Mexico from the Mexican government, the state of Texas began a campaign of northward expansion that would see it claim Colorado and Utah for its own. With the further fragmentation of the Union, Texas was able to ally with the Great Lakes' new power, the New American Alliance. By the start of the Great War in 1914, Texas was officially recognized as a world power, in the form we all know today as Large Texas. Now, this is, of course, all nonsense, but it's nonsense with a purpose. Large Texas is the culmination of hours of gameplay, forming alliances, cultivating resources, and fighting military battles to form it. There's a whole genre of similar video games that play around with the what-ifs of the past. And in doing so, these games have started to teach us about history in new ways. But turning history into a game presents some unique challenges for game developers, and raises questions about how those histories are portrayed. Historical fiction is a well-established genre in video games. Major franchises like Assassin's Creed, Civilization, and Red Dead Redemption all ground their stories in real-world history that you, the player, can reshape, and they've become wildly popular in doing so. Games like these are entertainment, first and foremost, but they're also embracing their learning potential with non-competitive educational modes and in-game reference links. As popular media goes, video games have an outsized power to shape how we look at history.
I love history, and like the fact that like I'm just horrible at fiction means that it's like kind of like the easiest thing to work from, because you just got all these raw materials there to work with.
This is Soren Johnson, a game designer who led the development of the acclaimed strategy game Civilization 4. His independent studio, Mohawk Games, recently released Old World, a game about leading a historical society through antiquity.
So you're this kind of like, there's this one city, and you've got this world with the Greeks and the Egyptians and the Persians, and you're kind of finding your place in it.
Both Old World and Civilization are what are known as 4X games. They force players to explore their environment, expand their civilization, exploit their resources, and exterminate rival civilizations. Old World focuses mostly on dynastic squabbles between ancient kingdoms, while conflict in Civilization can get a bit more advanced.
No! No!
Progression in these games looks like actual history. Players will uncover actual landmarks, implement authentic technologies, and face similar challenges as the societies their game is based on. Old World, in particular, models many of its events off of specific moments in history.
People do buy the game because they want to feel like they're touching history, right? What I would call is like a historical fantasia. It's kind of like this kind of fever dream of history, right?
So chances are the types of history you'll create in these games won't bear much resemblance to the real thing. But that's kind of the point. These games present a version of history that's malleable. By exploring the variables that determine the historical truths of these games, players can have a better understanding of why real-world events unfolded the way they did. This ability to play around with historical realities has sparked a lot of interest in using popular games in the classroom. One teacher at the forefront of these practices is high school history teacher Jeremiah McCall.
Thinking about history as something that's not predetermined, but is something that sort of is the result of choices made over time. I think that's something a game can do better than any other medium.
McCall is the author of Gaming the Past, a book about teaching history through video games. His website of the same name focuses on analyzing new historical games. One aspect McCall finds useful for education are how a game's mechanics, the tools and challenges they present the player with, can mirror actual history. Grand strategy games like Crusader Kings or Europa Universalis do a thorough job of mimicking the distant past, modeling such esoteric traits as succession laws and administrative efficiency. The devotion to getting the historical details right could, in theory, allow players to relive the history of their chosen state, but it also allows players to go wildly off book. See, for example, Large Texas. And McCall argues that style of play is also very educational.
Counterfactuals can really provoke some thought about why did the historical outcomes of something happen? What might have changed to allow it to come out differently? Because it allows you to think about, okay, what were the factors, what were the systems, and how do individuals sort of fit into this?
Several studies have found video games can supplement a more traditional history class by spurring students to get invested in the material they're learning about. But as with every other medium, games are constrained by their format. There inevitably comes a point where the game starts to get in the way of the history it's retelling. One common critique of historical games is that they're designed to be won. Things like victory conditions and objectives tell players both that history is a race to the finish line, and often that the way to win that race is by following a distinctly Western model of progress.
If you historically can make your civilization act kind of like how the United States has acted historically and follow the technological paths and things that it's followed, then you will be victorious. And there is something about that we should be really careful about, this idea of competition and victory being a possible outcome between cultures.
Mechanics that encourage claiming territory and conquering rivals can make for a fun video game. But a lot of cultural complexities can get lost in the singular drive to win a game. For example, it's perfectly possible to play around with the history of some Native American tribes in Europa Universalis 4. The game even rewards players with a No Trail of Tears achievement for overtaking the American colonies as a Cherokee nation. But success in that game still relies on forming a cohesive empire and conquering as much territory as you can, which just isn't how those cultures actually existed. The game's logic is predicated around Western-style nation-states. Anything divergent from that either gets pushed into the mold or erased as a powerless, quote, uncolonized territory. These factors have more persuasive weight precisely because the game is a system. The right way to rule a civilization is baked into the game's logic, an intrinsic rule of the virtual world. That means developers have to be deliberate about what values they import into their game.
If you're doing a game that deals with the modern era or just the whole colonialization era, yeah, I think I probably would have some thoughts about that if I was doing that again that maybe I didn't have during Civ 3 and Civ 4.
So far, the 4X genre has proven a poor fit for portraying indigenous cultures. But other games have had more success. Smaller, native-led projects are using games to retell specific stories that often don't make it into the larger historical narrative.
The way the history has been told and been passed on to generations of people is not a complete history. And I think that if people knew and understood that better, were a little more critical about what they're looking at, there would be more calls for more comprehensive history.
David Lewis is an assistant professor at Oregon State University and a member of the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde. He also contributed to the indie game When Rivers Were Trails, an adventure game about the seizure and division of tribal territory caused by the U.S. Allotment Acts of the late 1800s. When Rivers Were Trails focuses on crafting a specific experience, rather than laying out the historical sandboxes found in 4X games. But even without the empowerment that defines the genre, this game still immerses its players in the history it's retelling. It allows players to make decisions and face consequences from a perspective that often goes overlooked in history classes.
And so a lot of what we're doing here in Oregon, a lot of Oregon natives that are working in education are interested in new kind of products like this game that could actually teach in a more closer to what a native narrative would be or oral history would be, which has been noted by some scholars as a better way to teach. People really learn a lot from gameplay.
Ultimately, video games are still a powerful tool for bringing history to life, offering players new angles on which to view old events. But games are designed to be fun, first and foremost, and it takes real, critical work to ensure the lessons you're taking from a historical game end up being the right ones. This work around history in gaming is still going on. Upcoming grand strategy game Victoria 3, which simulates nations through the 19th and early 20th century, has had to put a lot of thought into how they represent slavery during this period. But this more critical perspective on gaming isn't happening in a vacuum. Video games are changing because the culture around them is changing too. It's not hard to find examples of an exclusionary culture surrounding video games. From juvenile ad strategies to targeted harassment campaigns, games and gaming culture has a long track record of trying to shut people out.
Ethics in journalism is not what's happening in any way. It's actually men going after women in really hostile, aggressive ways. That's what Gamergate is about.
This continued throughout the industry, targeting primarily people who are not straight, white, cisgendered men.
Despite this, both in the industry and on the consumer side of things, marginalized folks are becoming more numerous and more vocal about their experience with games. Many of them often end up using their platforms to advocate for a more inclusive industry, oftentimes braving a lot of vitriol and pushback. Thanks in part to those efforts, a lot of game franchises with long and storied histories have been taking a critical reevaluation of their content and their place in the culture. One of the most popular franchises is Dungeons & Dragons. This 70s-era tabletop behemoth has recently had to grapple with some outmoded ideas of its own.
Dracarys.
Fantasy stories can be a fun bit of escapism, and everyone can use a nice break from reality now and again. Especially now. But even the most out-there fiction and fantasy role-playing still has to reckon with its real-world baggage from time to time. And one such reckoning is underway for the popular tabletop game Dungeons & Dragons.
When I'm playing these games and when I'm telling these stories, I want myself and the people I'm playing with to have a good time. And if any aspect of it is making that harder for someone or for multiples of us, then we sit and we figure it out.
Gabriel Hicks is a game designer, voice actor, and cosplayer who's worked on a number of tabletop games, including some D&D game books, and he's gained a dedicated following for his work. He's also one of the many people who've been playing Dungeons & Dragons over the internet in this quarantine era.
When you analyze, you do this. Don't do that. Don't do that.
The iconic tabletop role-playing game has exploded in popularity over the past couple of years, thanks to a more accessible version of the game and the rise of high-profile D&D podcasts.
Abandon all hope, ye who enter the Adventure Zone.
And streaming shows.
Welcome to Critical Role, where a bunch of us nerdy-ass voice actors sit around and play Dungeons & Dragons.
The game's renaissance spiked even more after COVID-19 hit. Virtual D&D services have reported massive growth in users over the past few months. But amid waves of demonstrations calling for racial justice across America, D&D's parent company Wizards of the Coast admitted their game has its flaws in how it handles race, flaws that date back to the game's origins in the 70s.
Yeah, I think it's really just something that people were used to, because as we get older and smarter and learn more, we discover we use things that are archaic ideologies or terms.
The topic of race comes up surprisingly often in these tabletop games. One of the few things D&D players do when starting a game is to pick what kind of character they want to be, an elf, a dwarf, a human, etc. The game refers to this process as choosing your, quote, race. The game's mechanics attach physical traits to each race. For example, all orc characters tend to start out stronger and dumber than their human counterparts. Those distinctions obviously don't perfectly line up with a real-world concept of race. But the idea that certain kinds of sentient beings are naturally stronger or smarter than other types is still a troubling one for many people.
I don't like that we are bound to those stereotypes, to be honest. If there is an orc wizard who has spent the first 3 lives as a wizard literally just reading and learning and understanding, it would make sense if they're smarter rather than stronger.
A few months back, Hicks released his own unofficial module for D&D, which ties a character's physical attributes to their job, rather than their race. For Hicks, the module helps players explore characters that are less hemmed in by their fantasy species.
There was a bunch of people who said, well, Gabe, it doesn't make sense because they're an orc or they're a minotaur, so they have to be stronger. And it's not a good argument because this is a world where there's a canonical magical jar that can make gallons of mayonnaise. Anything can be possible.
Hicks isn't alone in this pursuit. Other D&D players and designers have stepped up to try and address how the game handles race. Game producer Eugene Marshall crowdfunded his Ancestry and Culture book on Kickstarter with the explicit goal of rethinking race in D&D.
How do I remove that unpleasant part, but still make it feel both like D&D, and also I want it to be something that anybody can just pick up and use without any trouble.
Marshall says D&D's default approach echoes the real-world concept of racial essentialism, the discredited idea that racial groups are defined by unique biological or genetic differences rather than by social values.
Nowadays, the only people that really believe this are, well, people that either don't realize what they're saying, they aren't educated on the issue, or they're people that are quite intentionally doing it, and they're using it as a racist ideology.
Issues of race run throughout fantasy stories as a whole. Author J.R.R. Tolkien's infamous description of orcs as the, quote, least lovely Mongol types has continued to haunt the genre. And regardless of any actual malice on the author's part, it's true that fantasy stories typically derive from a time with a much different understanding of race.
They present certain ideas, and we don't tend to be very actively thinking about what ideas we get from popular culture. You know, we consume it as entertainment, so we're not looking for what political positions we're getting from our popular culture.
Helen Young is a literature professor at Australia's Deakin University and the author of a book examining racial analogues in fantasy literature.
In the reality we live in, race is a social construct. There's no kind of genetic evidence for it existing. But in fantasy worlds, there is, right? So they're really, literally racist fantasies.
And that can enable bad actors to exploit those narratives. White supremacist website Stormfront infamously maintained a section on the Lord of the Rings movies for a time.
When the movies came out, I got super into it, and I figured you could probably get people who like such a super white mythos. A few of them are probably going to be turned on by white nationalism.
Dungeons & Dragons didn't create those trends, of course, and it's not solely responsible for ending them. But as more and more people flock to the game, it's facing an increasing need to expand its storytelling to fit its audience.
I love this game, but no person or corporation in general is infallible. And you want to hope for the best, but you also still have a personal right to want to hold people accountable.
Wizards of the Coast is still struggling with these issues. The company recently had to revise the lore on one of its products after it included some racist tropes. But the company has also started to move away from tying ability scores to race, a change that likely wouldn't have happened without advocacy from the fans. And the public faces of Dungeons & Dragons, be they live streamers, content creators, or official product writers, are starting to look as diverse as their audience. Even if the official company doesn't always get it right, there's a lot of people who are still working to make D&D a more welcoming space. Both tabletop games and video games are an important part of the culture. They're shaping and being shaped by the new waves of players who are coming to the industry in droves. Figuring out the best way to represent all these new players isn't always going to be easy or straightforward, but but it's an important task because video games should be for everyone who wants to play them.